Welcome and thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar on the Checkbook IRA. Today I'm going to be talking about what we really consider sort of the ultimate control over your retirement account. Of course, with a self-directed IRA, you really already have control, but taking it to that next level and using an entity in order to literally have check writing ability within the retirement account. We're going to talk today about the pros and cons of this strategy, and we'll also talk about who can write checks for you on behalf of the account. I'm going to talk a little bit about the rules, and we'll go over some of the different types of investments that you can make within this account. We do have many webinars, always no cost, no obligation, and I have a few coming up that may interest you. As I mentioned, we're going to talk briefly about the rules and investment types, but if you're really looking to learn more about these types of accounts and all of the things that go into investing through a self-directed IRA, please join me for my next webinar on February 8th so that you can learn more about the types of accounts, the rules for investing, and the investment strategies that we see on a regular basis. My name is Larissa Greene. I'm Director of Education with Advanta IRA. I do a lot of marketing and business development for Advanta. And I have been with Advanta IRA since 2011. When I started, I did a lot of new accounts, transfers. I did some transactions. I did check coding for money coming into an IRA. So that means rental income, interest income, things of that nature. I also did transactions. So I worked with clients to make investments on through their accounts. And so I've done a little bit of everything here, and I've been in business development since probably about 2013 or 2014, somewhere around there. And so I've done a lot of networking, taking classes and sponsored classes, and I have done a lot of presenting. So here's my contact information. If you have any questions on the information I'm sharing today, please feel free to reach out to me. You can dial my extensions or send me a quick email, and we can start a conversation on anything you'd like to know about a self-directed retirement account. Something that I like to mention is today we're going to talk about the rules for self-directed IRAs and some of the strategies, but something that we can't do is give any investment, legal, or tax advice. Everything that we talk about today is just based on IRS rules. And so if you have these types of questions, please feel free to reach out to me and ask them. And if it's something that I simply can't answer for you, I can definitely refer you to a professional that has helped our clients and contacts in the past figure out the answers to those questions. So if you say, hey, is this a good investment, or how does this work tax-wise, or anything like that, then I'm going to refer you to a professional that can help you with those questions. A little bit about Advanta IRA for those of you that are not familiar with us. We have been in the industry almost 20 years, and we have 2 offices, but we can help anyone nationwide and even worldwide. And so if you have a US-based retirement account, we can certainly help you even if you're not located within the United States. And our 2 offices are, one is in Largo, Florida, and the other is in Atlanta, Georgia. But the Largo, Florida office, which is where I'm based out of, is really sort of our corporate headquarters, if you will. It's where we handle all the transactions in and out of accounts. Our Atlanta office is a marketing office where we hold some seminars, and we have salespeople out of that office that sort of help people in that area, and also, again, nationwide. What makes us different from our competitors is just very simply our customer service. Every client with us has a dedicated account manager. That individual is going to help them with everything from making contributions to the account all the way through to their investments. And so they really get that individualized service. They get that person's extension and their email address, and they're always reaching out to that one individual when they need help or access or whatever it might be to their account. And I'm not really sure why, but a lot of our competitors don't have an account management system. Typically, you would be dealing with a person for one type of investment, or to make a contribution, or to find out, something about your account. All of these are different people that you would be working with. So our system has really sort of helped our clients feel like they're getting that dedication and that customer service that they're looking for with a self-directed IRA. We do have over $2 billion in assets under management, and so we've really grown in the nearly 20 years that we've been doing this. If you guys have any questions about Advanta IRA or how our dedicated account manager system works, please let me know. Feel free to reach out, and again, my contact information will be visible again at the end of the webinar. So what is a self-directed IRA? Well, I know a lot of times people will tell me, well, I have a self-directed IRA with my brokerage firm. I get to choose the investments that I'm making. But our definition of a self-directed IRA is something much more specific. So it's great that you can go to Charles Schwab or Morgan Stanley and self-direct those assets inside the market. But what we're talking about when we say self-directed IRA is private investments. So we don't handle anything inside of the market. So we're not competing with your brokerage firm. We're just filling the gap in the industry to hold those private investments that they have made it a business decision not to hold. So they're unwilling for you to say, purchase a piece of real estate and hold it within your retirement account because they're simply not set up to receive rental income or say, mortgage payments to an IRA account. They consider those assets hard to value. They don't want to be involved in the administration of those assets. And so that's what we do. And just simply the opposite of that is we've made it a business decision not to hold anything publicly traded. But the great news is that you can have a self-directed IRA and maintain your brokerage-based IRA as well. It's not an all or nothing strategy. You can move over just the amount that you would like in order to self-direct that account. And alternative assets include real estate. I think real estate and private mortgages are going to be the number one category of investments that we hold on behalf of our clients. We also see a lot of private placements, precious metals, and of course there's renewed interest in gold and silver bars and coins right now. We also do see a lot of foreign currency. There's futures trading with self-directed retirement accounts, cryptocurrencies, which is not on this list. And the interesting thing is that there isn't really any kind of list that the IRS provides us of investments that you can make in your retirement account, but instead they've provided us a very short list of investments you can't make in the retirement account. And so I'll go over that in just a few minutes, but you'll see kind of how that works. Also, what they've provided us is a list of individuals that you cannot transact with. And again, I'll go over that in just a minute. But very briefly, as this webinar is really going to be more directed towards checkbook control and how that strategy works. Many people haven't heard of self-directed retirement accounts very simply because there are not a lot of firms out there like Advanta willing to hold private investments. So there's very few of us, and so that means that really less than 4% of retirement accounts overall are invested in private investments. So that includes 401ks, 403bs, pension plans, all of the plans that are out there holding qualified funds. There is less than 4% invested into something like a private placement, for example, or maybe real estate and so on. And so even though the IRS has always allowed it, there's just simply not many of us out there willing to do it. And so I think that's a big question I get all the time is this must be something new. I've never heard of this. How long has it been allowed? And actually, it's always been allowed. It's just more common for you to find a brokerage account where you can house your IRA. So here are the self-directed plans, and I always like to show this diagram because a lot of times people think that it's only a Roth IRA that can be self-directed, and I'm not really sure where that comes from, but it's simply not true. I always like to say if it ends in IRA, it can be self-directed, and then there's some other plans that we consider qualified funds with the same rules as a self-directed IRA that we can help you with as well. So of course, you're going to see traditional and Roth IRAs. Those are the most common accounts that we hold. Of course, traditional being the most common account that we hold. You also have your employer-based plans, so SEP IRA, Simple IRA, and Solo 401k. Those are going to be for the self-employed individual. We also can help you with former employer plan and any money that you had in an employer's plan and you have now severed ties, you're no longer a participant of that plan, you can roll those funds from a 401k, a 403b, whatever it might be, into an IRA account and therefore self-direct. And this can be a very seamless movement. There doesn't have to be any taxes paid. So a lot of times people say, well, if I do roll it over into an IRA, am I going to pay taxes on it? And the answer is no, not necessarily. If you wanted to do like a Roth conversion, for example, you certainly could, but that is not necessary. You can go from like plan to like plan in order to avoid any tax consequences. And then that new IRA is ready to make investments, and those investments will continue to be considered tax deferred or tax free, depending on the type of account that you hold. We also have up here health savings accounts and education savings accounts, and these two accounts are considered qualified funds, and the rules for self-directing them are exactly the same as an IRA, and so we can therefore help you with those accounts as well. And like I said, I'm really not going to go over the accounts in this webinar, but my next webinar on February 8th is going to cover the types of accounts, and we're going to go into those with a lot more depth. So if you're wondering about a health savings account, if you're wondering about an education savings account and how those work, or maybe what type of retirement account is right for you, we're going to go over that, and that will maybe help you make a better decision as far as what you're looking to accomplish. So here is, again, a short list of alternative investments that are allowed within the retirement account. Again, this is not, the list put out by the IRS. This is just us giving you an idea of investments we see on a regular basis. So again, real estate is one of the most common investments that we see, and it could be rental homes, it could be commercial real estate and fixer-uppers, condos, duplexes, multifamily properties. All of these are allowed within the IRA. They do have to be for investment purposes, and I'll talk about that briefly coming up. But as long as they are for investment purposes, you can make these investments through the retirement account at arm's length so that they are earning essentially for the retirement account. We also see things like syndications and private stock. You can purchase land. There's no requirement on a monthly rental income on a property. So if you're doing like land speculation, you can certainly do that in a retirement account. We have seen equipment leasing, so we've seen ATM machines and large format printers, for Forex accounts, which is foreign currency trading if you're not familiar. Again, mortgages, tax liens, and the list sort of goes on and on. But more important on this list for what we're going to talk about today, you'll see LLCs. And so we're going to talk about how LLCs and trusts can be used as a way to gain checkbook control of your retirement account. So up here, we're talking about LLCs in a few different ways. Of course, it could be a single member LLC for checkbook control, or you might be investing with others into a larger LLC for investment purposes. It just depends on your strategy. So I'm going to go on today. And again, if you have any questions on these alternative assets that we see in a retirement account, please feel free to email me or give me a call. With checkbook control of an IRA, you're really sort of moving your funds into a retirement account, and then those funds are taking a next step, making another investment into some entity that is going to allow checkbook control. So it's important to understand that the account itself is first set up with Advanta. The money is received by Advanta IRA, and then from there, money is going to be sent to the checking account of this other entity that is formed for the purpose of the IRA. So a custodial or administration account is very simply where the administrator retains the uninvested cash, makes the investment on behalf of the client. So the client is going to direct us basically to go ahead and make an investment. We'll review the forms to make sure that everything is in the name of the retirement account. And then from there, the administrator receives the income, deposits it to the account, and pays any expenses at the direction of the client. And that's kind of where the account management system comes into place, because the client is going to work directly with their account manager in order to make these investments, pay any bills, receive any income. When you have a checkbook control account, the client personally obtains control over the cash by using this third-party bank account. So again, establishing either an LLC or a trust, funds go from the IRA to the bank of the client's choosing, and now the client can make the investment on behalf of their retirement account through this checking account, where they can pay bills, receive money for any income, and do any investing that they see fit. And I'm going to go into that in more depth in just a second, but just keeping in mind that using checkbook control doesn't get you around the rules. I get that question a lot. Well, what if I do an LLC? And it's important to understand that the LLC doesn't get you around the rules. You still have to abide by the IRS rules when making investments into your retirement account. So ways to achieve checkbook control, again, I mentioned the LLC and the trust, and so these are the two ways that you can have a third-party bank account where you can write checks for investments and to pay any expenses and receive any income on behalf of the retirement account. So the LLC, let's just go over sort of the components of each here. So the LLC will have a manager. It can be the client, and typically it is going to be the client. It's very rarely that I see a client assign the management duties to a third party. It's typically the client as the manager, and then they will be directing any cash into investments, receiving income, and paying expenses. That means that the check writing goes to the manager of the LLC. The assets of the LLC will just very simply be in the name of the LLC. So if I form Sunshine LLC, for example, then when I go to purchase a property, the buyer on the contract and all the way through close is going to be Sunshine LLC with me signing as the manager. The member of the LLC is the IRA, and that's very important. And I have examples of this as well, and I think that will be really helpful to see in just a moment. So with a trust, and this is a very specific difference between the LLC and the trust. So remember back here at the LLC, we talked about how the manager can be the client, and it usually is. That's normally what we see. With a trust, the trustee cannot be the client. It's just very simply that the trustee has a fiduciary responsibility, and therefore that fiduciary cannot be the client or anybody considered disqualified to the client and their IRA. We'll talk about disqualified persons in just a minute, but basically hiring a third party, non-disqualified trustee for that role. So the management of that trust is going to be a trustee. Who writes the checks? That's going to be the trustee. The title of the assets or the ownership is going to be in the name of the trust. So if I form Sunshine Trust, well, then it's going to be Sunshine Trust with whoever as trustee when you're titling assets. And then the IRA is both the grantor and the beneficiary in this case for the trust. And a lot of times people will say, well, I don't get that because it's really my IRA and it's my trust. And it's really the IRA. So you want to think of your IRA almost like your business partner. And since the IRA is putting in the money, then the IRA is the grantor and the beneficiary. So we're going to talk first about trusts, and we'll kind of go over definitions for that. But here's some types of trust: revocable trust, special needs trust, life insurance trust. You see those listed there. Again, parties in a trust: grantor contributes assets and cash to the trust. The trustee manages assets in the trust, again, the fiduciary, and then the beneficiary, ultimate recipient of assets in the trust. So that's all very important when you're forming the trust, especially for the IRA, because this is going to outline that the IRA owns it, and ultimately that these are typically going to be tax-free or tax-deferred investments. And there are two times when an IRA is exposed to tax, and I'll talk about that very briefly coming up here shortly. Let's see, the IRA again is both the grantor and the beneficiary. And typically what we see here is going to be, at Advanta, we're going to see personal property trusts or land trusts for use with an IRA. So a personal property trust will have a bank account, a third-party trustee, and that allows the third-party trustee checkbook control. A land trust is typically treated like real estate, meaning that we don't require you have a bank account for the land trust. We will pay expenses, receive income, and review the paperwork to help make sure that the investments are properly titled in the name of the land trust. And so we can help you with that, and we don't require you to have a bank account, but you certainly can. The third-party trustee is still going to sign all documents for investments, and ultimately you could have checkbook control of the land trust as well. Advanta, again, can pay expenses and receive income on behalf of the land trust directly, but you're still going to have your third-party trustee helping you make investments and sign off on any contracts, closing documents, and anything involved in the investment from there going forward. The key components of the LLC, basically, you're going to have your members. So owner of the LLC is going to be the IRA in this case. The manager or check writer is the decision maker, officer, president, however you want to name it. And then the operating agreement is essentially the document that says who the member is, who the manager is, and sort of the moving parts of the LLC. And that's very important. A lot of times people will say to me, well, I have formed LLCs in the past, but I don't need an operating agreement, right? And it is very important that you have an operating agreement when your IRA is concerned, because that is going to show who the manager is and who the member is. And we need to see that in order to fund the bank account for that LLC. You don't want to set up an LLC and call us and say, okay, well, I need you to move the funds, because we're not going to be able to. We need that document in order to verify that you're properly showing the IRA as the member in this case. And it's important to note that the IRA cannot be manager managed because member managed, because the member in this case is the IRA, which is an entity. This is going to be a manager managed LLC, so that you, as the IRA holder, if you decide to be the manager, you're going to oversee the management of this. The IRA cannot do it. So what are the rules? Again, it must be manager managed. It has to show the IRA as the member or owner of the LLC. That is very specifically Advanta IRA, for benefit of the account holder's name and account number. If it's not single member, then it's going to show the percentages based on the initial contributions to the LLC. If there's more than one owner, you cannot change the percentages for the life of the investment if it's among disqualified persons. So that's very important. Remember that there are some disqualified persons when it comes to your IRA. That also is going to go, those rules are also going to apply to your LLC owned by the IRA. And so we'll talk about who disqualified persons are in just a second. But essentially, if it's more than one member in this LLC, and let's say, for example, it's my IRA and my spouse's IRA. Well, my spouse is prohibited from doing transactions with my IRA. And so that means if I put 50,000 into the LLC and my husband puts 50,000 into the LLC, well, then that means our IRAs own it 50-50. When a capital contribution is needed, he can't put in 10,000, for example, and I'll put in 5,000. That will not work. We established that we own it, our IRAs own it 50-50, and that is how it must stay. We cannot inadvertently liquidate shares of the LLC by putting in different amounts when there's a capital contribution. You can include provisions into the operating agreement regarding prohibited transaction rules. If you need an attorney or a CPA to help you with the operating agreement and the formation of the LLC, we certainly can refer you to professionals that have helped our clients in the past. If this is a single member entity, there is no tax return required. If it is a multi-member entity, then you would have to talk to your CPA about what you would be required to do for filing. Something I need to mention here, and it's on this slide, second to last on the screen, you'll see if single member, if it is a single member entity, the liability protection is dubious under Florida law. And the reason I point that out is because it is going to be specific to your state. You would want to get an attorney to give you any kind of advice on this if you're looking for liability protection using an LLC. So we're here based in Florida, and so we know that the liability protection is dubious, and here cited is the case that sort of made that determination. So it's very important to understand the laws based on the state that you live in. Also, a question we get oftentimes is, well, how do we know that the IRS will allow checkbook control of a retirement account? And that's a great question, because it does seem that that might be prohibited, because if you are the manager of your LLC and you're writing checks, well, how come that isn't considered prohibited? And we do have case law that really sort of illustrates how this has worked in the past. And then, of course, it was reiterated by a tax court memo. So the first one here is Swanson versus Commissioner. And basically, in this case, Swanson formed a new LLC for the purpose of investing through his IRA and named himself the manager. The IRS didn't like it and took him to court, but the tax court said, well, you know, Swanson's not doing anything prohibited. He's not paying himself as manager. And so therefore we're going to allow it, because these are investments made just for the purpose of the IRA. And the reason it's cited as Swanson versus Commissioner is because he did go back and sue the IRS for his legal fees and won. The next one, again, reiterated through a tax court memo of T.L. Ellis, where he was doing something prohibited, and the IRS said, well, we would allow it, except there are prohibited transactions within the LLC. And so again, very important to make sure that you understand that even though you can form this LLC and have check writing capability, it doesn't get you around the rules. And so understanding those rules is going to be very important. So here are the rules. And again, I'm just going to go over them very briefly for you in this webinar. But basically, prohibited investments are going to be life insurance and collectibles. And remember, I showed you that bigger list at the beginning and said, well, this is not, any kind of full list of investments that the IRS will allow, but instead it's just a list of investments we see pretty commonly at Advanta IRA, because the IRS has only instead told us what we can't invest in. And so what we can't invest in, life insurance and collectibles. We have on the list coins, but I want to note that people do invest in gold and silver coins as well as bars, and how you know the difference if it's going to be allowed or not allowed, there is actually a list. So if you're looking at gold coins and you want to look, review the list and make sure what you're looking at investing in is going to be allowed, you can certainly send me an email. But basically, the value of the coin cannot be based on whether it's rare. So if it's rare or antique, and that's how the value is sort of looked at, then that is going to probably be prohibited. If the coin's value is based on the metal and what it's trading at, then that's probably going to be something that you can do. Again, there is a list, so if that's something you're looking at, please feel free to send me an email. Prohibited transactions, basically any transaction between the plan and a disqualified person. And here we're talking about section 4975, and you can, we cited it there for you to look up if you would like. Just check it out on irs.gov for more information. But basically any transaction, so buying, selling, trading, leasing, anything like that between the IRA and a disqualified person. And on the next slide, I'll have disqualified persons for you. The 2 times that an IRA is exposed to tax, remember we talked about that early on in the webinar. You have UBIT, or unrelated business income tax, and unrelated debt finance income tax. So the first one is going to apply when the IRA is receiving business income, or the IRA owned LLC, or the IRA owned trust. And it can also apply to private equity investment. So how does this work? Well, the best thing to do is talk to a CPA if you think you might have business income coming back to the IRA based on the asset that you're going to hold or the business you're going to invest in. Essentially, when you have something that's considered passive, you're really not going to be exposed to unrelated business income tax. So if you buy a property in cash, for example, and you have normal long-term rental income, no UBIT is typically going to apply. Or say private mortgage, you have a private mortgage and somebody is paying interest income back, or making mortgage payments back to your IRA. These are typically going to be passive investments. But if you own a portion of a business, for example, and business income is going back to the IRA, it doesn't make it prohibited. I want to make that point. It does not make it prohibited. However, this tax may apply. Another time that the tax will apply is if you purchase a property using debt. So if you buy a property with a mortgage, then you're going to expose the IRA to unrelated debt finance income tax. The mortgage does have to be considered non-recourse. The IRA does have to file an additional tax form every year and pay the tax. And the tax is essentially tax on the income related to the amount of debt. And again, I'm not going to go into that too much today, but basically that gives you an idea of when you should be asking those questions about potentially exposing your IRA to a tax. So here is our chart on disqualified persons. And remember that I mentioned a disqualified person is anybody related to you up and down your lineal tree, and that makes transacting with that disqualified person prohibited. And so it's the IRA owner and their spouse, parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren, and any spouses or business entities of those. And there could be some other people not listed here. So for example, if I had a friend and I wanted to make her primary beneficiary on my IRA, well, then she now becomes a disqualified person. And maybe the reasoning behind that is that, let's say I lent her money. Well, on the surface of that, that would not be prohibited as long as it was for investment purposes. I could lend her money from the IRA. We agree on an interest rate. She makes payments back to the IRA. But if she is the primary beneficiary and something happens to me and she inherits the account, now she has a loan to herself and that would be prohibited. And that's kind of why I think the IRS made primary beneficiaries, for example, a prohibited or a disqualified person, essentially. So again, no buying, selling, transacting, leasing, anything like that, hiring these disqualified persons to do work for your IRA, things of that nature, all of that is going to be prohibited. Now, you can certainly partner on investments with disqualified persons, but that's a little bit different. So you're partnering on an investment new to you, new to the IRA, and new to the disqualified person at the outset of the investment, and that would be permitted. And again, there are some specific rules that apply when you're looking at partnering. So now I'm going to go into some case studies for the IRA and for our example today and how to gain checkbook control. And I really like the case studies we put together here because it's really going to give you an idea of how this works. So we talked a little bit about LLCs. We talked a little bit about trusts and how those are different when gaining checkbook control. So for the first case study, we're going to talk about Joe investing in real estate directly through the IRA. So that will show you what the custodian or administrator account looks like when Joe opens his account with Advanta, and Advanta helps him make the investment directly through the IRA account. Then the next example will be an LLC, and then after that a trust, so that you can really compare the differences between these three examples and see maybe which one is right for you. So Joe has $150,000 in a traditional IRA and he wants to buy real estate. He decides on a single family rental and he finds a house for $100,000 and needs an additional $20,000 of work to get it rent ready. He projects the property will net a cash flow of about $1,000 a month after repair. So how does this work in his IRA account? So again, we're going to start with directly through the IRA. So Joe is going to open and fund his IRA account. He completes an online application. He transfers or rolls the money over from an IRA or a 401k. And he is ready now to have a contract written in the name of his retirement account. It's important here to note that everything from the deposit all the way through to the closing is going to be provided by the IRA. So let's say that Joe finds a property and he writes a contract and there's, $3,000 earnest money deposit required for the contract. Advanta IRA is going to actually issue that check. And so Joe is going to go to his account manager, provide the contract. His account manager is going to review the contract to make sure that his IRA is shown as the buyer. So Advanta IRA for benefit of Joe Smith, IRA number 800-1234. He approves the contract because we aren't going to check it for accuracy as far as what his agreement was with the seller. We're just looking for the information of the IRA. Once we have Joe sign it as approved, we're actually going to sign it on behalf of the IRA. So that's very important. In this example, the IRA, we are the legal signer of the IRA. So Joe needs to make sure that we sign the contract as well, and then he'll let us know who we're going to be working with for the closing, and we'll send the contract over to them. And like I said, then an escrow deposit will be issued from the IRA account. Joe will let us know who is involved in this closing. So he's going to complete 2 forms with us, basically giving us the name of the closing agent, the title agent, the closing attorney, whoever it is that he's working with, maybe a real estate agent, and so that we know, okay, we need to make sure we get the documents from those individuals or those companies, and that everything goes back out to those individuals that need to see a copy of everything prior to closing. Everything from contract to close will be in the name of the IRA, get Advanta IRA Services, LLC, FBO, Joe Smith IRA. And before we close, we're going to again have Joe review the deed, everything, the HUD, all the closing documents. Once he approves them, then we'll go ahead and sign, and we will execute the closing on behalf of Joe's retirement account and send the funds directly from the retirement account. After we have Joe approve everything and it is closed, Joe's IRA now owns the property, and Joe will let us know what expenses are going to be paid, who to pay and the amount to pay. So he's going to reach out to us, or he'll go onto his online account and request checks be paid to his vendors as he's doing those repairs. Remember, Joe determined that it needed $20,000 worth of work. So he is going to let us know who we're going to pay. Remember that it cannot be a disqualified person. So we talked about who those persons are. So Joe has to hire arm's length transaction type of businesses. So nobody related to him up and down his lineal tree, or any businesses owned by those individuals. Once he determines how much work is going to be done and who will do it, he'll let us know just simply by submitting invoices and requesting checks. Joe can track all of this activity on his online account so he can see the money going in and out. And then Joe will secure the tenant. From there, we will sign the lease on behalf of the IRA, and any rental income will come back to Advanta IRA on Joe's behalf, and we will deposit it. So there's a couple ways Joe can do that. Joe can hire a management company. We are not a management company. So if Joe's tenant sends the check 11 months of the year, and on month 12 we don't receive the rent check, we honestly don't track that. It's going to be up to Joe to track it through his online account. So if he wanted a management company in place to help him with his tenant, help manage his tenant, then he certainly could do that. He can also have the tenant send their checks directly to Advanta. When it is deposited, he'll get a notification. Or Joe can have his tenant send the check directly to him. However, it needs to be made payable to the IRA directly. He never wants to deposit the income meant for the IRA to his personal account. It will always be deposited directly to the IRA account, but if he wants to make sure those checks are coming in on time, he certainly can have the tenant send them to him, and then he would simply forward them on to Advanta for deposit. So once he receives them, he checks it off in his ledger and then sends it to Advanta. And again, those checks will be made just as the contract was, payable to Advanta IRA for benefit of Joe Smith, IRA number 1234, and then we will know to deposit those as rental income for the property that he purchased. Once Joe's ready to sell the property, he's going to let us know, and we're going to walk him through that closing just as we did with the purchase. It's very important to note that all of these things are determined by Joe. So he's going to determine what property he wants to buy, if any work needs to be done, who he will hire as vendors in order to get that work done, who he's going to lease the property to, and how they make those payments. So Joe is really in charge of this account. We are just being directed by Joe to assist him so that the account stays tax deferred or tax free in the name of the retirement account. So next we're going to talk about using checkbook control through an LLC. So again, the first example was Joe making the investment directly through the IRA. In this case study, we're going to talk about how he does it using an LLC. It's important to note that Joe is still going to open and fund his Advanta IRA account. The money does have to come to Advanta IRA first. So that's a question we get a lot. People will say, well, if I'm going to open an LLC checking account and the money is going to end up there anyway, why don't I just open the LLC and send the money there directly? The reason is because we need to help you keep the account's tax deferred or tax free status by first receiving the funds. If you go to your brokerage account and you request those funds be moved to an LLC, they're going to code that as a distribution. It's not considered a trustee to trustee transfer or a qualified rollover if it doesn't first come to your IRA administrator. So that's super important that it gets done. It comes over, you open the account, the money comes over to us, and then it goes to the LLC and we will send it over. And then that way we're signing off that we're going to receive the funds and keep them in their tax deferred or tax free status. And so he's first going to open his account, request the transfer or rollover from an old 401k. Once those funds are received, Joe's ready to set up the LLC. He's going to choose the state he sets it up in, so there's no requirement on the state that the LLC is formed. Joe is going to choose the name, and he's going to work with an attorney or CPA to create that operating agreement. So again, the articles name Joe or another individual as the manager, and they should not mention the IRA. That's another question we get very frequently is, well, where do I put my IRA in the articles? And actually, that information doesn't go to the articles, just simply typically the manager's information, which would be Joe or the individual he decides will be manager of that LLC. So on the operating agreement, The IRA in this case is listed as 100% owner. Remember, we talked about how you can partner into an LLC. And if you decide to do that, then of course this is not going to be a single member LLC. There will be two members named. But in this example, it's just Joe's IRA, so it's going to be Advanta IRA for benefit of Joe Smith IRA number 1234 as the member. Joe will name himself the manager. He will then submit the operating agreement to Advanta IRA so that his account manager can review it for him. The account manager is going to look to make sure the member information is correct, to make sure the operating agreement shows that it is a manager managed LLC, and if Joe is naming himself the manager, that he is not receiving compensation for his duties as manager. Remember, that's very important. He doesn't want to receive compensation for that duty. That would be prohibited. Joe is going to open the bank account in the name of the LLC. And from there, we're going to move the funds to the LLC on Joe's behalf at his direction. So once that the LLC bank account is established, he's going to let us know. We'll move the money over there, and then he is ready to start investing in the name of the LLC. So from here on out, whatever Joe named the LLC, that information is going to go contract to close. Again, this example being that he's purchasing real estate, but now this time using the LLC. So let's say that he names it Sunshine LLC. Sunshine LLC has a checking account at Joe's local bank. And then Joe will sign the contract with Sunshine LLC as the buyer. He'll sign as the manager, and everything from contract to close will be in the name of the LLC. From there, he will pay or go to closing with the LLC again as manager. All the money will come out of the LLC checking account for that. And he will then pay expenses from the LLC checking account and receive income. So once his tenant is in place, the tenant will make their check payable to Sunshine LLC. When Joe is ready to do any work, he'll write checks for expenses directly from that LLC bank account. A lot of times people will say, well, if I have a tenant, do they have to send the check to Advanta? No, in this case, the flow of funds will just very simply be right through that checking account. And you don't have to report transactions to us. Just annually, we ask for an update on the value, and that includes the checking account balance and any assets held within that LLC. But the day-to-day, we do not need that information. This third case study is going to be Joe making that same investment again into real estate using a private trust. And so again, very important, Joe is going to open and fund his Advanta IRA account first. From there, he's going to transfer money into Advanta. And then once we have the trust documents and Joe's approval, we'll fund the trust bank account. So what does that look like? So Joe will provide the private trust document to Advanta IRA with, again, the IRA listed as both the grantor and the beneficiary. Advanta IRA for benefit of Joe Smith IRA number 800-1234. Joe names a non-disqualified third-party trustee. So again, nobody up and down his lineal tree, and any spouses or business entities of those, all of those would be considered prohibited. And so if you'll notice, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, those people are not considered disqualified persons. So he could name one of them as trustee, or he can reach out to a friend or his CPA or attorney. Those individuals can all be a trustee for him. The trust document is approved by Joe, so even though he's not really the signer in this case, he's still going to read and approve it for Advanta's purposes. The trustee will sign it, and then Advanta will sign it as well on behalf of the IRA. And from there, the trustee will open the bank account. And so that's very important because remember now, Joe has checkbook control through his trustee. The trustee will be the individual opening the third-party bank account and also signing everything from contract to close in the case of his IRA purchase. The trustee will also receive checks for income and pay any expenses out of that checking account. Joe's trustee obtains a tax ID for the trust to open the bank account, and Advanta IRA will issue the check. The money will go over to the trust, and now the trustee is ready to make those investments, receive income, and pay expenses on behalf of the IRA-owned trust. Another very important piece of information when you're using a third-party entity for checkbook control is the movement of funds. A lot of times when you have checkbook in hand, it's very easy to say, write a check to yourself personally for a distribution. And unfortunately, that is not the way that it works. It's always important to go through your administrator when you need something that would be reported to the IRS. So, for example, if you're making a contribution to your IRA, you're not going to do it directly to your LLC bank account or to your trust bank account with your trustee. You're going to first do it with Advanta. The money will come in if you're making, so let's say this year you're making your $6,000 annual traditional IRA contribution. It's going to first come to Advanta. And when the funds are available, then you would instruct us to move it over to your LLC. And now you can begin investing with that money as well. And distributions are treated the same. Since that has to be reported to the IRS, we have to do our job in doing that. And so let's say that your LLC has $110,000 in there and you would like to take 10,000 out as a distribution. You cannot write yourself a check, or in the case of a trust, have your trustee write a check to you, but instead money must come from the LLC or trust back to Advanta IRA, and then you would instruct us to give you a distribution, which we would do, and then report that to the IRS as required by IRS rules. So very important. If you're not sure when you get to this step how to do it or how to make a contribution when you have checkbook control, you can reach out to your account manager and they will give you instructions on how to complete either a contribution or a distribution, or how to send money for whatever reason back and forth. And so that is something that your account manager is still there for, even if you have checkbook control. So very important. So when you're partnering with IRAs, checkbook control might make that situation a little easier depending. So multiple parties, including IRAs and disqualified persons, again, can be partnered. And that might make management of that investment a little easier. So if you have, for example, IRA funds and some parties aren't using IRA funds, it might be easier to partner through, say, for example, an LLC, so that the money is pooled together and then just one check goes out for investments, one check comes in for any income. And so if you're using personal funds, let's say an IRA funds in a partnership, and you have a tenant in place at that LLC owned property, well, then that tenant can write one check to the LLC. If you're invested directly through Advanta IRA with no checkbook control, Advanta can only receive the tenant's share of that check. And so that's really important, because then in this case, you would either have the tenant writing two checks, or you would maybe have a management company in place in order to receive the income and maybe pay expenses for you. So that might make it a little less cumbersome when making those investments. Again, the manager of the LLC will hold all investors' funds and make investments on behalf of the LLC. And we talked about this last one here, using caution when partnering with a disqualified person if you have to add capital. So remember, I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that if you have a disqualified person in there, as a member of the LLC, you cannot change, it's very important, you cannot change the percentage of ownership once it's established. So again, in my example of my IRA and my husband's IRA partnering, if we own 50-50 at the outset of the LLC, then it always has to remain that way. He can't put in an additional capital call of 10,000 and I put in 5,000. That won't work. We're inadvertently liquidating shares, and therefore we are transacting within the LLC, and that would be prohibited. So if there is a capital call, if there's a reason that we have to put more money into that LLC, we would maybe both make our contributions. Let's say we're making our annual contributions for the year. We would both do that first with Advanta, and then Advanta would move those funds to the LLC, and they have to be, in this example, in equal portions, because that is the percentage based on the percentage of ownership. So pros and cons of buying directly through the IRA. Definitely a pro is keeping you at arm's length. A lot of times when people have checkbook control, it's just easier to engage in a prohibited transaction. So if you came to us and said, hey, Advanta account manager, I want to write a check to myself and lend myself some money, we would say, I'm sorry, unfortunately, that is prohibited. You're not allowed to do that. And so by very simply bringing the investment to us, it is easier for you to understand the rules, because when we can, we're going to definitely help you there. We're also going to keep very clear records of all the activity in and out of the account. So if you ask for a statement and you've had your account for 10 years, everything for the last 10 years down to the penny is accounted for. Some of the cons of going directly through the administrator is, of course, the potential for more fees. So we are a fee-based company. That's how we earn our keep. And so if you had many investments over the course of the last several years, you're going to pay an investment fee and an annual fee for each of those investments. We do have options where you can save on fees, but ultimately, if you have an LLC or a trust and check writing capability, you're going to just pay the single investment fee to get money over to Advanta. And then from there, you're going to have an annual record keeping fee for that asset. And you, of course, don't have the ability to write checks for immediate purchases. So if you like to do your deals over a handshake and a cup of coffee, it's going to be a lot slower with Advanta sort of helping you make those investments. Now, I will say that Advanta can do investments for you within 24 to 48 hours as long as we have your money at Advanta and it is available. As long as that is true and we get all of your investment documents, we can do an investment very quickly. But if you would rather do it, in 10 hours instead of 24 hours, then maybe checkbook control is something you'll talk to your CPA or attorney about. And of course, just pros and cons of using checkbook control: quick access for things like auctions and when you're purchasing things like tax liens and deeds. You can hold more assets with lower fees, and possible asset protection and anonymity. And again, talk to your attorney about that, and also remember that it's going to be dependent upon the state as well. And you're going to also be responsible for all of your own record keeping. So are you not good at record keeping? Do you struggle a little bit with keeping records and receipts and all of the stuff that kind of goes into that additional responsibility? Then you may want to invest directly through Advanta so we can do the record keeping for you. If you feel confident in the way that you keep records, then this might work for you. Another thing that you can do is make investments directly through Advanta as your administrator for, say, the first year or the first 2 years, and you can kind of follow along and see what records we keep. And when you feel confident that you can do that without us, you can always move to checkbook control later down the line. Again, the lack of oversight by the administrator, you still do have an account manager with Advanta. You still will get an account manager, but many people don't reach out to us again after they have checkbook control. Once they have checkbook control of that account, we almost never hear from them. So keep in mind that if you do go with checkbook control, you still do have an account manager in place that can assist you with questions on those accounts. So knowing which strategy is best for you, it's really always a matter of deciding what you're comfortable with and then talking with your CPA or attorney, whoever it is that might advise you on this, as to whether or not they feel that this would be an effective strategy for you. So many times we see people say, well, I'm not comfortable, or, oh, I asked my CPA to help me with this, and they said, no, just let Advanta do it. And the truth of it is we are a record keeper. That is our job. And so if you want us to do our job, then we're certainly happy to help you with that. If you would rather have checkbook control and just reach out to us annually and let us know what the value is of that entity so that we can update it with the IRS on your behalf, that is completely up to you. Most clients choose to simply have the assets held by us. And so when we're talking about real estate, we see about 50-50, but investments overall, most of the time we hold them directly. It's very rarely that we see an LLC or a trust used for other assets outside of real estate. And like I said, it is possible to switch between the strategies. You can always start with Advanta, and then you could always go with checkbook control later on. So as I mentioned, we have classes all the time, and they're always no cost, no obligation. And you can check out our events by going to advantaira.com/events. We have a twice a month networking event on Zoom, so I encourage everybody to join us for that. Even if you don't have something you want to present, because it is an open forum, you are welcome to just listen in and see sort of what is going on across the country as far as investment strategies. And we usually will have people give us an update on what they're seeing in their area as well. So it's a lot of fun. And that's every other week. If you go to our events calendar, we call that event Pitch, Promote, and Prosper. I also have a webinar coming up that February 8th if you're interested in learning more about the different types of accounts, prohibited transactions, and the investments that we see in an IRA. And again, I'll be going over health savings accounts and education savings accounts as well. And you can always check out our blog and our video library. So if there was something that you missed and you wanted to go back and review it, you certainly are welcome. You'll find it on our video library and also our YouTube channel. It's really easy to get started. You're welcome to reach out to me, send me an email, give me a call, and I'll help you open your account, get it funded, and then you are ready to start investing. I think the biggest thing is people ask me, well, how quickly can we get started? So once our account is open and our money is there, how quickly can we do an investment? Remember, once your account is established and the money is available, that's very important. You have 7 days from the date the account is open from which we can fund. But if your account has already been established and you fund it, then we can do the investment within 24 to 48 hours. If you're curious how that works, again, give me a call or send me an email and we can go over it. My name is Larissa Greene. I'd like to thank you for joining me today on this webinar on checkbook control of your retirement account. We went over today LLCs and trusts and how they work for checkbook control. Please give me a call or send me an email if you have any questions on this content or anything else regarding a self-directed retirement account. I hope that you'll join me again on February 8th when I go over the different types of plans and strategies for investing. Thank you.